Ryan Whitaker, our newly appointed Chief Executive Officer, didn't bother with context. He stood in front of the entire company and pointed at me. Nicole, this is exactly the kind of obsolete thinking that's killing us. Not a private meeting, not a performance review, a full company town hall streamed to every regional office. For a moment, the room felt colder than the numbers on that slide. And speaking of cold, it's been freezing where I am lately. So I'm curious, what's the temperature where you're listening from? And if you're still here with me, drop your lucky number in the comments. I have a feeling we're going to need it. I am Nicole Morgan, Principal Systems Architect, SAN. For 21 years, I built and maintained the core transaction engine that processes millions of logistics movements across our $11 billion corporation. My job isn't flashy, it's structural. I design the logic that keeps inventory synchronized, contracts reconciled, and revenue recognized correctly. When systems don't fail, nobody applauds. That has always been fine with me, Ryan. On the other hand, was hired to be applauded, 40 years old, MBA, former tech startup executive, brought in by the board of directors to accelerate transformation. He likes words like disruption, velocity, narrative. He says stability with the same tone most people use for rust. On the screen behind him flashed a slide titled Rebuild the Core. We cannot let outdated architecture hold back shareholder value. He continued, if only one person understands a system, it's already broken. The room went quiet in that corporate way. Eyes down. Pens still. Nobody volunteering to be collateral damage. 2 weeks later, Human Resources delivered the formal notice. Termination effective immediately. Reason lack of innovation. No disciplinary history. No missed targets. No compliance flags. Just a strategic decision. Before my access was revoked, I submitted a 147-page migration risk assessment detailing every dependency in the legacy architecture Ryan planned to replace. He approved the transformation plan 7 minutes after receiving it. That moment was just the spark that ignited it. What happened afterward changed everything. But I want to point out that some details in the story have been fictionalized with the help of artificial intelligence to highlight the lesson and make the story more engaging. I hope you will continue to join me in what's to come. If not, please take care of yourself first. Rest is very important. The transformation officially began the week after I left, and Ryan made sure it looked spectacular. He hired a technology consulting firm for $8 million to rebuild everything. The launch presentation felt more like a product reveal than a systems overhaul. Polished slides, dramatic taglines, a massive banner across the screen, reinvent the core. From a distance, it almost looked convincing. Up close, it was reckless. For 21 years, I had worked inside that architecture. I knew where the seams were. 18 years of historical data stored under evolving standards. Hundreds of undocumented dependencies quietly linking modules that had been expanded, patched, and reinforced over time. Redundancy layers I personally designed to prevent small discrepancies from snowballing into financial distortions. None of it was glamorous. All of it was essential. During my final executive meeting, Ryan leaned back in his chair and said, "If one person understands it, it's bad architecture," I answered calmly. "If one person reads the documentation, it's good leadership." He smiled like I had proven his point. Migration started immediately. Timelines were compressed to satisfy investors. Testing cycles were shortened. Internal concerns were labeled resistance. The consulting team reported steady progress, and the executive dashboard glowed reassuring shades of green. 3 weeks into the transition, historical data began mapping incorrectly between old records and the new schema. Shipment timestamps shifted. Contract identifiers misaligned. Small discrepancies, nothing dramatic. The dashboard, however, still showed full operational success, and that was the first real problem. They called it transformational. The press release went out before sunrise. Ryan Whitaker stood in front of a polished backdrop and announced that the company had successfully completed its core system modernization. Analysts praised the bold move. Investors applauded the speed. Internally, a congratulatory email labeled the transition a defining milestone. I read it from my kitchen table. At first, nothing looked catastrophic. That was the unsettling part. The issues emerged quietly. Like hairline fractures in reinforced concrete, a cluster of duplicate invoices began appearing in the billing queue, small enough to dismiss as reconciliation lag. Inventory reports from 2 regional hubs showed mismatched quantities against physical counts, not dramatic discrepancies, just numbers that refused to align. Meanwhile, fulfillment times stretched by hours across several distribution corridors. Trucks weren't stalled. Exactly. They were hesitating. Ryan addressed the leadership team and called it normal transition noise. According to him, every modernization effort generated temporary turbulence. He used phrases like optimization curve and adaptation phase. Publicly, he remained confident. Privately, managers started requesting manual cross-checks. From a technical standpoint, the pattern was predictable when dependency mapping is incomplete. Legacy identifiers don't translate cleanly into a new schema. Minor data misalignments propagate across reporting layers. Each module continues functioning, but their outputs no longer agree. That disagreement compounds. By the end of the 3rd week, finance began noticing timing anomalies in revenue recognition. Deferred shipments were posting in the wrong quarter. Duplicate invoice entries were inflating receivables until they were manually reversed. None of it had reached customers in a visible way yet. It lived inside spreadsheets and internal dashboards. Then the chief financial officer discovered something larger. Preliminary quarterly figures showed an $18 million discrepancy tied to reconciliation errors between legacy contracts and the new platform. The numbers had not been released to the public. Not yet. Officially, the transformation was a success. Unofficially, the cracks were widening, and only a handful of executives understood how deep they might run. When the numbers refused to reconcile, the company did what companies often do under pressure. It went hunting for a villain. An internal review committee was formed to investigate possible sabotage. The phrase alone would have been funny if it hadn't been so predictable. I had been gone for barely a month, yet somehow my absence was already being treated as a liability. Apparently, it was easier to suspect the architect than to question the demolition crew. They pulled archived versions of my code. External auditors were granted temporary access. Every line I had written over 21 years was combed through, as if it might confess. No backdoor, no hidden trigger, no kill switch waiting for a dramatic activation, no poison pill buried in a comment block. What they found instead was something less theatrical and far more inconvenient. They had removed the dependency control layer I built to prevent cascading reconciliation errors. That layer had quietly validated cross-module identifiers before transactions were finalized. It flagged inconsistencies before they reached financial reporting. It wasn't glamorous, and it didn't produce headlines. It prevented embarrassment. During migration, the consulting team labeled it redundant. Redundant is a dangerous word in the wrong hands. Without that validation layer, mismatched legacy identifiers flowed freely into the new schema. Billing referenced shipment codes that inventory didn't fully recognize. Revenue logic calculated from incomplete contract relationships. Each module performed its assigned task. Together, they drifted. The review committee eventually reached the conclusion that there was no malicious code, no deliberate interference. The failure wasn't sabotage, it was subtraction. Then someone uncovered an email I had sent 2 days before my termination. It was addressed to Ryan Whitaker, Chief Executive Officer, and copied to the Chief Financial Officer and Chief Technology Officer. The subject line read, "Dependency Mapping and Cascading Risk," in that email. I described precisely the scenario now unfolding: identifier misalignment, reconciliation drift, compounding financial distortion. I recommended a staged migration with full dependency validation. Ryan's reply was brief. Over-engineering slows innovation. That message was forwarded to the board of directors during the investigation. No commentary, just a timestamp. Suddenly, the company no longer needed a villain. It needed an explanation. The first external crack appeared when one of our largest enterprise clients froze a $240 million logistics contract. Their finance team had detected inconsistencies between shipment confirmations and invoicing summaries generated by the new system. Nothing catastrophic on the surface, just enough misalignment to erode trust. In their email to our sales division, they used the phrase data reliability concerns. That phrase cost more than any technical fix. Within days, the market reacted. Our stock slid into double-digit losses over the course of a single week. Analysts who had praised the bold transformation began asking sharper questions during earnings calls. Was the integration complete? Were reporting systems stable? Had adequate controls been tested before full deployment? Ryan Whitaker went on financial television to reassure investors. Legacy culture resists change, he said smoothly. Short-term volatility is natural when you modernize at scale. He framed the issue as emotional resistance rather than structural failure, according to him. The turbulence was cultural. The numbers suggested otherwise. Internally, the atmosphere shifted from celebration to containment. Department heads were instructed to review outgoing reports manually before distribution. Finance worked late, reconciling discrepancies that shouldn't have existed. Legal began drafting language in case client disputes escalated. Every executive understood that reputation, once dented, compounds like interest. The board of directors convened an emergency session. That is when the tone truly changed. During document review, a board member asked whether the transition team had examined the complete technical handover I submitted prior to my termination. My migration risk assessment, my dependency documentation, my validation protocols. Silence. An internal audit confirmed that my handover archive had been stored in the system, but never opened by Ryan's leadership team. Not once. No download logs, no access records. The files existed, time-stamped and intact, waiting for readers who never arrived. The market had already delivered its verdict. Now the board was beginning to ask why. The call from the board arrived without apology. They did not ask me to return as an employee. They asked whether I would consider serving as an independent consultant during the audit review. The distinction mattered. I agreed under one condition: full access to system logs, migration scripts, and financial reconciliation data. I did not request a title. I requested visibility. The consulting contract they sent over listed an hourly rate higher than my former annual salary would have suggested. I signed it without commentary. When I walked back into the building, I was escorted to a temporary office rather than my old one. It suited me. Emotional distance makes analysis cleaner. My review began with the migration plan approved after my termination. The dependency mapping was incomplete. Cross-module relationships that had been manually validated in the legacy system were assumed to be standardized in the new architecture. They were not. Redundancy layers control checks I designed to catch identifier mismatches before financial posting had been removed in the name of efficiency. Testing cycles were accelerated, and historical datasets were sampled rather than fully reconciled. None of these decisions were illegal. They were simply impatient. I reconstructed transaction flows across billing, inventory, and revenue recognition modules. Then I compared them to the legacy validation logic I had documented in my handover. The pattern was consistent. Mismatched contract identifiers were propagating through reporting layers undetected. The errors were small at origin and magnified over time. During my presentation to the audit committee, I kept my tone measured. This is not sabotage. I said, it is structural omission. I projected a simulation based on current drift rates. If reconciliation discrepancies continued at the existing pace, the misalignment would extend beyond domestic reporting. Within 30 days, cross-border payment settlements would begin reflecting inconsistent contract references, triggering compliance flags in international clearing systems. In other words, the issue would no longer remain internal. The room stayed quiet as the projection advanced week by week, without a controlled rollback and full dependency restoration. I concluded, the distortion will reach international payment channels within 1 month, No one asked whether that estimate was dramatic. They understood it wasn't. If you agree that demanding full audit access and proving the need for a controlled rollback was the right move, leave a 1 in the comments, because when you speak up, you're not just reacting to a story, you're reinforcing the value of accountability in real life. The decision came just before sunset, and it carried the weight of something irreversible. The board of directors voted to initiate a phased rollback of the new system. Not a full retreat, at least not yet, but a controlled restoration of critical modules to their previous validated state. It was the first public admission that the transformation had gone too far. Too fast. Ryan Whitaker objected immediately. "Rolling back signals weakness," he said, his voice tight but steady. "It tells the market we failed." One of the board members responded without raising his tone. "So does losing credibility." The room fell into the kind of silence that doesn't invite applause. It invites consequences. The rollback plan required precision, billing, inventory reconciliation, and contract validation layers would be restored in stages to prevent total operational disruption. Data sets from the past 6 weeks had to be isolated, audited, and carefully reintroduced into a stable framework. No one pretended it would be clean. The only goal was containment. By midnight, engineers were in the operations center executing restoration scripts. I stood behind them, not touching the keyboard, reviewing the sequence. Every command had to be deliberate. If they reversed modules out of order, the mismatches would multiply instead of shrink. The first attempt to restore contract validation failed. The backup snapshot taken immediately before the migration had already absorbed minor corruption from incomplete dependency mapping. The second archive showed similar inconsistencies. Each successive snapshot revealed traces of drift. That was when I asked them to retrieve a backup from 4 years earlier, one created during a prior infrastructure reinforcement project I had led. At the time, I insisted on a full architectural image rather than incremental storage, arguing that true redundancy required depth, not convenience. The request had been approved reluctantly when the older image was mounted in a sandbox environment. The difference was unmistakable. Clean dependency structures, intact validation layers, no residual mapping distortions. It was the only version robust enough to serve as a reconstruction foundation. For the first time that night, no one questioned my judgment. The rollback stabilized the system, but it did not stabilize the mood. While engineers worked to reconstruct the architecture from the clean backup, the board's compensation committee began reviewing executive performance metrics tied to the so-called transformation. That review was supposed to be routine. Instead, it became combustible. I was not in the room when they opened the compensation file, but I was asked to attend the follow-up discussion as a technical advisor. The chair of the committee spoke carefully, as if each word required clearance. Ryan Whitaker had already received a multi-million-dollar performance bonus for what had been formally categorized as a successful transformation initiative. Successful. The phrasing landed heavily. At the time, the bonus was approved. The migration had not been fully completed. Risk assessments had not been independently audited. The financial discrepancies were already forming beneath the surface, though they had not yet reached public disclosure. Revenue misalignment had begun distorting quarterly projections. Manual corrections were being applied quietly in finance. Yet the executive summary presented to the committee emphasized velocity, modernization, and market positioning. It did not emphasize dependency gaps or validation removals. As I reviewed the documentation, my frustration remained controlled, but it was no longer abstract. Compensation incentives drive behavior. When rewards are tied to optics rather than structural integrity, integrity becomes optional. One board member asked directly whether the technical team had certified the system as stable prior to bonus approval. The answer was evasive. Certification language had been framed around deployment milestones, not reconciliation outcomes. In other words, the definition of success had shifted midstream. The committee's tone hardened. They requested a detailed timeline correlating executive communications, migration phases, financial reporting adjustments, and compensation triggers. What began as a technical correction was evolving into a governance question. By the end of the week, several institutional shareholders formally requested a governance review. Their letter cited concerns about risk disclosure, executive incentives, and oversight failures. The crisis was no longer about code. It was about accountability. The report arrived without drama. It was over 200 pages long, compiled by an external governance firm with no incentive to soften language. The document did not speculate. It documented timeline charts, email transcripts, compensation triggers, migration approvals, audit findings, everything laid out in sequential order. I read it slowly. The conclusions were precise. There had been no sabotage, no malicious code, no deliberate manipulation of financial data. There had, however, been a systemic disregard for documented risk analysis. My migration assessment had been acknowledged, but not reviewed in substance. Technical safeguards were removed without full impact modeling. Deployment milestones were prioritized over validation benchmarks. Executive communication emphasized market optics over structural integrity. The firm's language was careful, but unmistakable. Strategic decisions had been influenced by external perception rather than internal engineering reality. In corporate terms, that is as close to a reprimand as you will ever see in writing. The Compensation Committee cross-referenced the findings with executive incentive payouts. Shareholder pressure intensified. Analysts began asking governance questions during earnings calls instead of product questions. Credibility, once abstract, became quantifiable. Ryan Whitaker addressed the company in a brief internal memo. He announced he would step down as Chief Executive Officer for strategic reasons and to allow the company to move forward under unified leadership. The phrasing was sterile. The meaning was not. There were no raised voices, no dramatic exits, just a recalibration of power within days. The board initiated a restructuring of the executive oversight process. Technical risk certification would require independent sign-off before any transformation milestone could trigger compensation incentives. Governance protocols were amended in writing. Then the chair of the board requested a private meeting with me. The conversation was direct. They asked whether I would consider returning, not as a consultant, but in a formal technical leadership capacity overseeing architecture governance with independent authority from marketing strategy. The irony was almost mathematical. I had been terminated for lack of innovation. Now they were asking me to define it. I did not accept the CEO chair. Power, when offered as redemption, can be another form of theater. I had no interest in becoming a symbol. Instead, I accepted the role of Chief Architecture Officer with written authority guaranteeing technical independence from marketing strategy and investor messaging. Governance protocols were amended so that no structural overhaul could bypass documented risk certification again. That mattered more than a title. The first company-wide meeting after the leadership transition felt different. No neon slides, no theatrical taglines, just numbers, data integrity metrics, and a clear recovery roadmap. I stood at the podium not to defend the past, but to clarify the future. Innovation isn't replacing what works. I said, it's understanding why it works. The room was quiet, but not in fear. It was attentive. We rebuilt methodically. Validation layers were restored permanently. Dependency mapping became a required discipline, not a footnote. Migration plans were staged and audited before approval. Within 2 quarters, reporting stabilized. Clients reinstated suspended contracts. The $240 million account resumed under stricter data verification terms. Market confidence recovered gradually, not through slogans, but through consistency. No one used the word obsolete anymore. Not in board materials, not in executive summaries, not in performance reviews. The irony was not lost on me, but I did not dwell on it. Justice in corporate life rarely arrives as applause. It arrives as policy change. I was never interested in revenge. I was interested in correction. And correction, when grounded in documentation, logic, and accountability, is more durable than disruption ever will be. What this experience taught me is simple, but not easy. Stability is not the enemy of progress. Ego is. I didn't lose my job because I lacked ideas. I lost it because I refused to decorate risk with pretty language. And if there's one practical lesson I want you to carry from this story, it's this: document everything. Do the work with integrity. Put your warnings in writing. Because when pressure rises, memory fades. But records remain. Public dismissal always does. But dignity is not determined by someone else's slide deck. It's determined by how steady you remain when the room turns quiet. If you were in my place, would you have chased applause? Or protected the structure? That's not a rhetorical question. It's a real one. Where are you listening from right now? I'd genuinely like to know. If this story resonates with you, if you believe accountability matters more than optics, consider subscribing. One subscription helps stories like this reach people who feel invisible in their workplaces. A comment from you might encourage someone who is being told they're obsolete. A simple share could shift how someone thinks about leadership tomorrow. You're not just watching. You're participating in a conversation about responsibility. And that matters more than any title ever will. This story was fully created and produced by our team. We do not copy or borrow content from any other channel. Thank you for staying with us and listening until the end.